Fierce battles are happening right now. The Ukrainian armed forces are forcing the Russians to flee. The Russian army is falling apart at the seams and the enemy is suffering heavy losses at the front. Ukrainian defenders are destroying all of the Kremlin's plans. This is a breakthrough. The Ukrainian armed forces are advancing, the Russians are panicking, and only a few kilometers remain to the border. Putin's meat grinder is running at full capacity. The enemy is sending in sabotage groups, but the Ukrainian armed forces are foiling their plans and going on the offensive. Hellish footage from the front lines for your attention.
Armata.
It is the 1273rd day of the Great Russian-Ukrainian War. Almost 3.5 years of daily battles, artillery shelling and drone attacks, thousands dead. But the result, if you look at the map of hostilities, speaks for itself. Moscow, which boasted it would take Kyiv in 72 hours, has, after 1,010 days of bloody fighting, captured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. These are the conclusions reached by analysts from Indipstit.
Starting from November 12, 2022, as of today, 108,651 square kilometers are occupied. As of today, that's 114 to 493 square kilometers. The enemy has occupied 5,142 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. This amounts to 0.96% of the total area of the Ukrainian state within its internationally recognized borders.
The Russians did in fact achieve significant operational successes, but that was in the first weeks of the invasion. At that time, Ukraine was simply not ready to face what was once considered the world's second army, which simultaneously advanced on all fronts. Back then, the enemy managed to capture Kherson, Mariupol, and parts of the Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions.
Everyone realized that we needed to fortify ourselves immediately. After losing the Kharkiv region, even the Russian Federation realized that victory couldn't be achieved on the move. So, from their side, if you want to hold your ground, you have to fortify immediately. And in all these fortifications, all these positions, they disregarded almost all the basic rules that existed at the start of the war. Russia was breaking through our defenses very heavily. That's why Ukraine pushed the Russian Federation back. After that, everyone shifted to more or less positional fighting. They fortify, dig trenches, use forest belts and tree lines. And in this, the fighting continues.
But later, counter-offensives by the armed forces of Ukraine pushed the occupiers back by dozens of kilometers. This was a turning point in the war. Since November 12, 2022, the front has stabilized. Russia is still trying to advance, but not on such a large scale anymore. For Ostermetz, the positions of the ZSO, hoping to bite off, if possible, some Ukrainian land. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Kupiansk, Chasiv Yar, Robotin. Thousands of stormtrooper attempts, but progress is minimal. Tons of 300 tons, 500 meters. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been lost, but the strategic picture has hardly changed. Now the enemy is conducting offensive actions that are mostly local in nature. Pressure, attrition, destruction of infantry and equipment. However, the Russian dictators have not succeeded in capturing significant territories.
Despite these losses, and his losses are constantly increasing, capturing every kilometer and every position is costing him more and more killed and wounded each time. The statistics bear this out. First, his rate of advance has slowed down significantly. Second, the level of losses is very high, but they are still trying to achieve the goals they've set for themselves with such confidence.
They won't have enough resources, enough objectives, or enough capabilities. All those things they bragged about so much before the war turned out to be a sham. Why did the general purge start in the Russian Federation? This is the place of the direct dictator Putin for all the military generals who for many years convinced him that our weapons had no analogues. Everything is prepared, everything is great. But as it turned out of a well-fed, million-strong army, only about 170,000 people at the very start of the war were actually ready to fight. Everyone else was not ready. There was no proper communication, no supplies, not enough ammunition, nothing was there in sufficient quantity. Everything had been sold off, everything had been stolen. And now this is a huge place, a huge punitive machine that punishes the generals for this deception, which shows that the Russian war machine is, for the most part, just a puff of smoke. Yes, there are people, yes, there are determined allies. Iran, North Korea. but the Russian Federation itself cannot cope with Ukraine.
Ukraine will definitely win this war. Even under conditions of shell shortages and the aggressor country's superiority in manpower and aviation, Ukrainian defense remains resilient, and the successes of the Russians are much less than what Kremlin propagandists claim. Their soldiers are being wiped out on the front lines by the tens of thousands. Equipment is burning on the battlefields, and entire armies of the aggressor are being destroyed under the blows of the Ukrainian military.
Under the cover of a possible ceasefire, the Russian army is actively moving columns of armored vehicles, tanks, and manpower to the front. Judging by the published videos, the occupying forces' equipment is moving toward the Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions. According to military experts, it is precisely there that massive assault actions by the Russians may take place in the near future.
Now there is a stabilization of the front line, let's say, according to the set plan, thanks to the heroism of our defenders. So regarding pieces of territory, they want to say, let's exchange these pieces of territory. We will completely remain in the Moscow region, Kharkiv region as well. And you please hand over to us what we have written in our so-called constitution. Part of Donetsk, a portion of Donetsk, whatever remains there, about 30–40%, half of Kherson should go to Zaporizhia region. That's the kind of conversation that could take place.
The Russian dictator is putting pressure on Ukraine even at the diplomatic level. Despite not having any significant successes on the front line, Putin still does not give up hope. He keeps trying to grab more and more pieces of Ukraine. He
wants to exchange a pause in the war, the killings, for the legalization of the occupation of our land. He wants to seize territorial gains for the second time. He was allowed to take Crimea, and this led to the occupation in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. He did not receive preventive punishment when he gathered troops on our borders. This led to a full-scale war and the occupation of even more parts of Ukraine. Now Putin wants to be forgiven for seizing the south of our Kherson region and Zaporizhia. We will not allow Russia to take the entire territory of Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, or to make this second attempt to divide Ukraine. I believe that Russia is making a second attempt and we are facing a third, so we are standing firm on clear Ukrainian positions.
If Putin does not want peace, then he must be made to want it. That is why Ukraine and Europe have presented their own plan to end the war. As the Wall Street Journal writes, the first stage of any settlement must be a ceasefire. The plan also states that any exchange of territories is only possible on a mutual basis. That is, if Ukraine withdraws its troops from some regions, Russia must withdraw its forces from others.
First, there must be an honest end to the war, and it depends on Russia alone. It is Russia that must end the war it started. Second, Ukraine and all partners nevertheless accept the necessity of a ceasefire, an end to the killings. There is only one party that objects to this. That is Putin. His only card to play is the ability to kill, and he is trying to sell the cessation of deaths at the highest possible price.
At the same time, as Western journalists report, European officials insist that any territorial concessions by Ukraine must be backed by strong security guarantees, including the potential for Ukraine's membership in NATO.
What is needed is not a pause in the killing, but real, lasting peace. Not just a ceasefire at some point, or months down the line, but an end to the fighting now.
And while the truce has not yet come, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to forcefully drive the occupiers from our land. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Ukrainian armed forces are counterattacking and achieving success in the Kupiansk direction. This is already the second day in a row. According to geolocated footage published online, the Ukrainian armed forces recently repelled enemy attacks and advanced to the southwest of Kondrashivka. At the same time, analysts reported the day before that the Ukrainian side had also advanced to the southwest of Radkivka, which is north of Kupiansk. In addition, our defense forces have liberated and completely cleared the settlement of Besalivka in the Sumy region. According to the General Staff, the operation involved units of the 33rd Separate Regiment and the 24th Separate Assault Battalion. As a result of the operation, the enemy suffered significant losses. Meanwhile, the occupiers are close to semi-encircling the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration, military analysts note, in the area of Rodinske. The enemy has advanced a good 4 to 5 kilometers. The main fighting is currently taking place in the area of Zaliznytsia on the Dorozhne-Rodinske stretch.
Geographically speaking, the military formations are not yet completely encircled, but their logistical supply lines have been practically and effectively cut off, and bringing anything whatsoever in or taking anything out has already become entirely impossible.
The Russians also tried to break into Pokrovsk itself. Out of 150 occupiers, only about 30 made it to the city, but even they failed to achieve any results. However, military experts do not rule out that the armed forces of Ukraine may be forced to leave the city, if the pressure from the occupiers does not ease. However, for now, there are no prerequisites for this, and our defenders are still successfully repelling enemy attacks.
If it turns out that we absolutely have to leave the strategic city of Pokrovsk, then an extra 2 or 3 precious days, or even an entire week of our brave troops remaining and staying within the city limits in this particular city and then subsequently withdrawing from it is simply not justified under the current circumstances. Over the year of fighting near Pokrovsk, quite a lot of people have been lost, so to speak. The enemy's manpower and equipment, let's say the military mission in Pokrovsk, can already be considered accomplished. It has been fulfilled several times over. So let's approach this calmly. In war, sometimes you have to retreat in order to move to other positions where you might be able to hold the defense better. The enemy isn't breaking through anywhere. There aren't any open areas where the Russians could make significant advances, nothing like that.
But even among the residents of Russia over there across the border, things aren't going so well, as they say. Russians, like Ukrainians, are getting used to living under constant shelling. The only difference is that, unlike the Russian army, the Ukrainian armed forces strike exclusively at military targets, not at civilians like Putin does. Last night, unidentified drones attacked the Saratov region. Russians are widely complaining about explosions and a fire in the regional center, in the area of the local oil refinery, which became a legitimate target for the drones.
God, please help. What should I do? I'll handle it.
According to Russian media reports, a whole series of explosions thundered over Saratov and Engels last night, about 8 in total. Russians claim that air defense systems were allegedly operating and flashes were also seen in the sky. However, the burning oil refinery is clear evidence of the poor performance of the occupiers' air defense.
Things are really quite tough there.
At Saratov Airport, there are significant time restrictions on the arrival and departure of aircraft. In addition, the governor of the Russian region announced the threat of repeated drone attacks.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Now that's news. Foreign troops in Ukraine. Global support is at its peak. 10 countries are ready to defend Ukraine. Moreover, Putin has agreed to a meeting with Zelensky. All the details are coming up in the report.
Representatives of 10 countries are ready to send troops to Ukraine after the war ends to support peace. According to sources from Bloomberg News Agency, after the meeting in Washington, a plan was discussed to send British and French troops to Ukraine as part of a peace agreement, including the number and location of the servicemen. It is known that in total, 10 countries have expressed their readiness to send military contingents, including in other formats. However, whether Americans are among them and the nature of any support from the US remains unknown. Importantly, the negotiations on security guarantees will involve the NATO commander in Europe, as well as the chiefs of defense staff of the member countries. The terms of the guarantees themselves will be agreed upon in the coming days, preferably this week, stated the president of the European Council, Tonio Costa. According to Bloomberg sources, the first stage of the developed package of measures will include assistance in strengthening the Ukrainian armed forces through training and reinforcement. The administration of US President Donald Trump stated that Putin has agreed to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Furthermore, the White House spokesperson stated that the US will help organize such bilateral negotiations. Earlier, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Ray Lavrov, stated that this meeting needs to be carefully prepared. Meanwhile, the State Department claims that a personal conversation between Zelensky and Putin could take place within the next 2 weeks. In particular, it is proposed that such a meeting be held in Gorshny, Italy or Switzerland. Meanwhile, Trump became so preoccupied with the issue of Ukraine, or perhaps more with his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, that he even refused to go on vacation and decided not to visit his golf club. The White House even stated that their boss hopes he will get into heaven if he ends the war in Ukraine. Earlier, Donald Trump said in an interview that if he can make it so that 7,000 people are not killed every week, that would be wonderful.
Sanctions, war, and dependence on China are all driving Russia's economy into a huge pit. Last month, the budget deficit amounted to $13 billion, and since the beginning of the year, it has reached a total of $54 billion. This is more than the annual expectations. Moreover, expenditures have increased 9 times more than revenues. How problems with the economy are being covered up in Russia and what all this could lead to. Watch more in the following report.
The war is costing the Kremlin dearly. The budget deficit of the Russian Federation for the first 7 months of 2025 amounted to $54 billion. This was written on his page by the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak.
The Russian budget today is a bubble. Just in July, the deficit amounted to a staggering $13 billion. From January to July, it totaled $54 billion. This exceeds the annual expectations. Expenditures have increased by 28% year on year. Revenues only by 2.8%. You can pretend to be Sauron all you want, but when your economy is bleeding out because of the war, you're nothing more than a sinful golem, hiding your meager pocket from the eyes of the whole world.
13 billion rubles. That's more than the annual expectations. The gap between revenues and expenditures is simply catastrophic. The hole in the budget is big, but not that terrible, say Russian economists.
The situation is becoming much worse than it was in 2023, 2024. If in previous years the authorities somehow consistently missed their budget deficit targets, sometimes overshooting by 1 trillion or 1.5 trillion rubles, as a result ending up with a hole in the budget of 3.5 trillion rubles, then this year the situation has become truly dire. The war has been going on for 3.5 years now, and there is a systematic destruction of the civilian sectors of the economy. Dozens of industries have become chronically unprofitable, and there is a sharp decline in oil and gas revenues. And now we see that just in January through July, in the first 7 months of this year, the budget deficit has already exceeded the entire revised plan for the current year. 4.9 trillion rubles. And just to put that in perspective, that's 4 times more than what the Ministry of Finance initially planned at the end of last year when they approved the budget for this year.
Back in the spring, economic publications wrote that since the end of 2024, a sharp decline has begun to take shape in the Russian economy. The downturn came after a period when the Russian economy was showing growth, despite sanctions and the war. This was also facilitated by additional budget injections, high prices for raw materials, and the militarization of the economy.
The high-frequency index, as well as the Goldman Sachs estimate, shows that since the end of last year, Russia's annual GDP growth has dropped from about 5% to roughly 0. Weber, the Russian Development Bank, observes similar trends in its assessment of monthly growth. The business turnover indicator calculated by Sberbank, Russia's largest lender, has declined. The government, though more cautiously, admits that something is happening. At the beginning of April, the central bank noted that recently, a decline in production has been recorded in a number of sectors due to a sharp drop in demand.
Despite the figures and expert opinions, Putin has his own view of the budget situation.
As for the federal budget, the situation here is stable.
A couple of weeks ago, he said that all Russians have already paid for the war through soaring prices and a budget deficit, and claims that military spending will be reduced. But in reality, we see that military expenditures are actually increasing by 25-30% year on year and will continue to grow next year. And accordingly, this means that it won't just be a one-time printing of money this year, but a year of growth, a much tougher economy, and that Russians should get ready to tighten their belts to unpopular decisions and to an even more severe increase in all types of levies. Tariffs of monopolies, housing and utilities, recycling fees, excise taxes, duties, the failure of semi-national projects and cuts, sequestration of spending on the population, the social sphere, healthcare and education.
The situation is so dire that in many regions of the Russian Federation, according to the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine, one-time payments to those who sign a contract with the Russian army have been almost halved.
Amid the federal budget deficit and deepening financial problems, one-time payments for those who signed a contract with the army have been reduced in the following regions: In Bashkiria, the payment dropped from 1.6 million rubles to 1 million, and in the Yamalonenets Autonomous Okrug from 3.1 million to 1.9 million. In the Belgorod region, payments have fallen from 3 million to just 800,000. In Nizhny Novgorod, payments dropped from 3 million to 1.5 million.
In July, the EU introduced its 18th package of sanctions and lowered the price cap on Russian oil from $60 to $47.6 per barrel. As a result, according to Bloomberg, Russia's oil revenues fell by a third in the second summer month. And although only the Kremlin knows the real state and deficit of the budget, it seems that a default in the Russian economy is not far off.